Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name's Logan, and today I'm going to start talking about how to kind of jump into comics, how to start that hobby. It can be a little intimidating, especially in superhero comics, and this is going to be kind of a rudimentary guide how to try to get into the hobby. Just like any hobby, you think of like sports or anything, there's a lot of terminology that's kind of interlaid into the foundation of that hobby, and I'm going to start with a list of some terminology, some slang terms that might help you kind of feel your way around the comic book world. I'm going to start with the ongoing series. An ongoing series is a series of a comic book that goes on longer than 12 issues. I say 12 issues because that's an important distinction that's about to come up next. An ongoing series is like most comics really from any publisher are ongoing. And these can be a little harder, trickier to jump into because there's usually a lot of volumes, a lot of pieces to them, and they require more dedication than a limited series, which is our next distinction. Limited series are comics that are intended to be self-contained stories. They're not expected to go on longer than more than one or two volumes, and they're not ongoing, and they have a definitive end when they're announced. And there's two types of limited series. There's a mini series and a maxi series. A mini series is any comic that's was 2 to about 6 issues. They can be anywhere in between. And a maxi series is a comic that goes from anywhere between like 7 to 12 issues. Sometimes maybe more, but usually they try to limit maxi series to 12 issues. These usually play out over a year or so in the comic book world. They ship monthly usually. And mini series, maxi series, like I said, are usually self-contained stories, and those might be easier to jump into or read because they're self-contained. Usually when they come out in volumes, they're in one big volume or two big volumes, and they're usually easier to read that way. And there's also one-shot comics. Usually these are tie-ins which tie into other events that are going on in comics. Sometimes in comics there'll be events, especially during the summer, that'll happen, and sometimes there'll usually be like one or two series that the event runs through, but there'll be tie-ins that maybe take over an ongoing series, or there'll be one shots, which are standalone issues. They'll have a number one on them, but they'll usually say one shot or number one shot, and these are standalone issues per se. They're not intended to go any longer than the one issue. They just tell a story that usually ties into this event, and that can be a little confusing, but I promise you, it's not once you kind of look at what they are. Then we have to go through the people that work on comics, the creators. First, you have the writer, who writes the scripts and the dialogue for the comic book, and then it goes to the illustrator or artist or penciler, and they pencil out the comic. They do the lining of the art, and that goes to the inker, who outlines the comic in ink, either on paper or on a computer, and they add shading, they add text, there's some depth, and they turn the sketch into an outline drawing. And that goes to the colorist, who adds color, more shading, brings the image from black and white to life. And then finally it goes to the letterer, who adds the voice bubbles and the text and the letter boxes and all that onto the issue. And that's a particular job that I don't feel like a lot of people think of. But comics can be made or broken by bad letterers. Sometimes they try to fit in too much text into one bubble, and that can be a problem on the writer as well. A letterer has to, if there's a cool character, they can come up with a cool, special way that their voice bubble looks, so they can illustrate that this character is from another world or they're really evil. And it's important that the letterer makes it so you can actually read the issue in a nice way or do interesting things that almost seem second nature to the comic. And then we have a run. A run is a particular length of issues that a creative team meaning usually it just refers to a writer and an illustrator, but it can often refer to an inker and a colorist and a letterer as well. And a creative team that run is a creative team that works on a character or a team or a comic book series for a certain amount of time. So you think of how there's 1,000 issues of Detective Comics. There's been many runs in a Detective Comics, the whole series. There's 1,000 issues, but that does not tell one cohesive story all the way through. A run usually is a cohesive story. They might reference the run previously to them, whatever the work of the writer and artist they did before them. Usually the runs are self-contained. Usually those are what you want to look for if you're trying to get into a certain character. Instead of looking at, oh, I want to read Batman, there's particular runs of Batman that are critically acclaimed, and you can look those up. You can even look up on Google what are some of the best Batman runs. Off the top of my head, recent years, like the last 20 years, Batman's had incredible runs in creative teams. Think of Grant Morrison's run as a writer was amazing. Scott Snyder's run is amazing. Tom King's is definitely different, but I really like it. So I'd look at any of those. Uh, it's basically, yeah, a run is a segment of issues. Sometimes they last only. Sometimes a run is only a handful of issues, or it can be 200. It just that's kind of what you want to be your guide to getting into a particular character. And then there's what we call in the comic book world, and then what the industry calls it too. There's the big two publishers. Big two obviously being DC and Marvel Comics. They're the major publishers. They're the ones that get most of the money. They're always the ones in the top 10 comics sold per month. They get most of the movies, the merchandise, the TV shows happening. They're the biggest publishers because they've been around the longest. But sometimes there's a big three that I refer to. Image Comics being the third one, but usually it's the big two, and then all the other publishers kind of cascading down. Image Comics is definitely the third biggest publisher. They're known for series such as The Walking Dead, Saga, Spawn, Savage Dragon, The Wicked and the Divine, among so many others. They are hugely popular. Most of their properties, not most of, but a lot of their properties have been adapted into TV shows and movies, whether you know it or not. And after that, we have IDW, who is another publisher who they kind of do more licensed material. They do like Ninja Turtle comics and Transformers and Ghostbusters, Doctor Who, kind of licensed TV shows and movies that do comic book spin-offs or tie-ins. And then you have Dark Horse, who does a lot of licensed material too, but they're also known for Hellboy and now the Black Hammer series, which is critically acclaimed. I haven't read it myself, none of it, but I've heard it's very good. Then you have Dynamite Comics, who is another publisher. I can't think of any of their characters at the top of my head, but they're seen in the comic shops pretty often. And you have Valiant Comics, who are looking to make their own cinematic universe pretty soon. They're known for characters like Exo, Manowar, Ninjak, Bloodshot, among many others. Then you also have Boom Studios, who is most popular for their critically acclaimed Power Rangers comic. I have not read myself, but it is on my list to get to. So those are the biggest comic book publishers. Of course, there's so many others, but those are the main ones that you're going to see in the stores. And the big two definitely have a hold on the market more than the other publishers, Image being the next biggest. And the big two publishers, Marvel and DC, are usually relegated to just superhero comics or in that kind of genre, very action oriented. Not necessarily always, but usually if they're not action oriented, they're still superheroes. And Image has their own superheroes. They have Spawn, Savage Dragon, they have the Invincible series, but in Image you're gonna see more crazy off-kilter science fiction fantasy stories that take place in other worlds. So there's different publishers have different flavors, and they're worth checking out. I'd say Image is definitely there's a little bit more room for creativity because it's creator owned content. Creator owned means that if a creative team, a writer, artist, etc., goes to Image and pitches a series and it gets picked up, then that writer, artist, creative team own the rights to that series or character, and they own the film rights, the merchandising rights, and Image just becomes the publisher, the distributor of their comic. Whereas Marvel and DC, if you create a new character for Marvel and DC, Marvel and DC own that character, and you don't hold any of the rights to that. And Marvel and DC have the right to use that character or team or group of characters long past if you were to leave the comic book industry. And so that's kind of the difference. So Marvel and DC are definitely a little more. It's understandable. They have a brand to hold, and they want to hold on to their characters more, so they don't get as much risky material. They don't get a lot of rated R material. Marvel and DC have certain labels, or imprints is what they're called. An imprint is a sub-publishing genre of an existing comic book company. Image is made up of several different imprints held by different creators. That's not as important to know, excuse me. Uh, DC is one of their most famous imprints. I believe it's ending now, actually, sadly, is Vertigo Comics, which is where they posted their more darker material, their more racy, mature content, like the critically acclaimed Sandman comic, which is just incredible. Most of their Swamp Thing comics, Why the Last Man, which is an amazing series. All those filmed are there. That's usually when Marvel and DC publish their darker, more mature content and falls under an imprint, so as to let consumers know, so there's not a kid picking up a super dark issue. And what you won't get out of Marvel and DC is you won't get a lot of experimental content. Image and some of the other companies are more willing to allow creators to do really crazy things and really weird things because it's the creator's brand. It's not Marvel and DC's brand. So there's different flavors of comics you'll get from each of them. Marvel and DC always scratch an inch for me. I love superhero comics, but Image has a special place in my heart for a lot of crazy, weird, inspiring ideas. And after that, you have to think of to get into superhero comics. Then, if you wanted to get into a superhero comic, think of it as a massive soap opera. You think of how long the Days of Our Lives have been on. You don't really have to go back to the beginning of Days of Our Lives to understand the new stuff. You can jump into a new season as soon as it starts, and you can kind of feel your way around. There might be things that you don't remember or you don't know, and there's things far enough along in the past that they don't even like mention on the show anymore. That's how I kind of see superhero comics. They're basically never-ending soap operas, and you can kind of jump in whenever there's a new number one or a new run begins. Whenever a new writer or an artist take over a comic, that's usually when you want to jump in and start, because they'll be acknowledging the past history of the character. But usually a good run or a good writer and creative team will, whenever they start their run, they'll make it a jumping on point, so that you need to know very little about the character to really understand them and enjoy their comic. So you really want to look for new number ones. Sometimes when they relaunch a comic book, when a new creative team takes over, they'll give it a new number one, they'll start at number one again, and they'll rebrand it, relaunch it, so it's more appealing to new readers and it's easier to follow where there's a new creative team. Sometimes they won't do that though. Sometimes a writer will leave a comic at issue 645. They won't have written all those 645 issues, but a new writer will take over. And so basically you want to look for the delineations between runs. And those can be Google search. You can look up essential reading for a certain character, and there's plenty of websites that'll have essential reading lists for characters, and they'll give you the actual issues, or they'll give you links to Amazon, which are really useful to find these volumes and trade paperbacks is what they're called. When a trade is basically when a comic book gets contained into a volume. A trade paperback is the first printing of it, when it's just a paperback copy, and the slang term is a trade. Sometimes they'll get put into hardcover editions, or multiple volumes be put into a bigger edition, which sometimes they'll call them books, and they'll be the bigger editions. And then if there's enough books, enough volumes, sometimes they'll be collected into a compendium, which is a huge, expensive hardcover, very nice collection of comic books. And that can be a little confusing too, but it's just more of once you hold your hands on a volume or a trade paperback, and you'll understand the difference. And think of a superhero comic as a soap opera, yeah, like I said, and you just have to jump in and feel your way around. Um, Wikipedia and wikis are your friends. They have always been my friends in reading comics. I don't need to use Wikipedia and wikis as much as I used to, but when you're first starting reading comics, if you see these characters, because a lot of these characters don't look the same, or there's plenty of characters, thousands of characters that aren't in the movies or the TV shows. So if you see these unfamiliar characters or characters you know very little about, it might be kind of inconvenient when you're reading, but just pop up on your phone, Google them, sometimes you can just go on Wikipedia and spiral down until your knowledge gets better and better about these wide universes in Marvel and DC. It's You just have to kind of take a leap of faith, as Spider-Man might say. Wikipedia is your friend. You just gotta kind of feel your way in. I guess do yourself a favor, and if you're gonna jump in, just jump in when there's a new number one or a new volume. You can look for on the paperbacks and the volumes. They'll say like number one at the bottom. So you want to look for number ones. Try to get yourself started. Those are the best places for you to start for most series, most characters and teams. And just use Wikipedia. I say you definitely, like I said, you want to do yourself a favor and start at clear starting points for characters or runs and creative team startings, and anything that you can't fill in the blank in, just use Wikipedia. You just gotta kind of swing into it. You don't need to know everything about character to start reading them. You don't need to know about every single issue of Batman because nobody does. You just have to jump in, and eventually you'll start learning more of the characters or be able to be familiar with them. And there's still characters I have to look up after reading comics like nonstop for like 7, 8 years now. I mean, there's people who read all their lives who never have seen a certain character before and they have to look them up. So don't be intimidated by not knowing things. That's part of the joy of reading superhero comics is getting to jump into this deep universe. And I know that can be intimidating because it is so deep and there is so much to know. But if you start on a number one issue or a new run or a new creative team, you'll be fine. You just gotta jump in there. Another thing I'll recommend is DC. I think every year puts out an essential reading list. If you look up DC essential reading list, whatever year, it doesn't really change much from year to year. Sometimes they'll add things, sometimes they'll take them off. But anything in the past, like however many years they've been doing their reading list, is worth a read. They have an essential reading list that gives you the best places to start or the best critically acclaimed stories to read for certain characters. Usually they don't get past like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and the Justice League, but these are good places to start. And they give you a good list of more self-contained stories that can kind of get you interested in certain characters. Off the top of my head, I'm just gonna throw you some superhero comics that are kind of worth reading. It's been collected so many times now. If you want to read a good Batman comic, a good beginner Batman comic, Batman: The Long Halloween. It's in collected volume. It's a standalone thing. You just have to have a very rudimentary knowledge of the main Batman villains like Joker, Penguin, Poison Ivy, Catwoman, etc. If there's any that you don't know about, just like I said, Google them. It's a very first reader friendly Batman comic and has amazing art by Tim Sale. That's a good place to start if you wanted to read a Batman comic and try to get into the feeling of superhero comics. Another good one. It's a maxi series, The Vision by Tom King, Marvel comic. It's very atypical Marvel and superhero comic, but it's starting to become more of a common, I guess, writing style. Tom King is an amazing writer, and The Vision tells the story of Vision, from the Avengers. He's tired of saving the world. He wants to be a human, really. So he tries to create a family of his own of more androids, and disaster ensues, and it becomes very Shakespearean, and it's really worth a read. It's really well written, and I know a lot of people aren't a fan of Vision in the movies, and I think this will make you a fan, and it looks like it's what's going to be the loose basis for the WandaVision show, so maybe you should read that before the new show starts on Disney Plus. And for some non-superhero comics to jump into, These are what I'd recommend. They're easier to start into, but they're also weirder than a superhero comic. If you read Image comics or other like non-superhero cape comics, they're definitely going to be weirder, and they're often more adult. But I think that's where a lot of some of the best writing in comic books shines, and some of the craziest ideas. And usually these are kind of easier to jump on because they're not worried about tying into other series. They're self-contained. They might have many volumes, but they have a clear, definitive start point where you don't need to know anything prior from the last 50 to 80 years. Some of those series, pretty much anything by the writer Brian K. Vaughan. He's one of my favorite writers, regardless of comic books and superheroes. He's just an amazing writer who can craft these crazy characters. Um, for his series, I recommend Y: The Last Man, um, and Saga, which Saga is my favorite comic ever. I mean, if I had to tell you to read one comic book in your life, it'd be Saga. It is a crazy but adult and mature, R-rated, epic fantasy and sci-fi story, but it is definitely on the weirder end. So if you want to kind of dip your toe in, I'd say maybe start with Y: The Last Man. It's still weird. It has a lot of adult themes, but it's not nearly as weird or weirder right off the bat as Saga is. So I'd recommend either of those. Saga if you're feeling really risky and crazy, but Y: The Last Man if you just want to kind of dip your toe into what comic books can be like without superheroes. And uh, often, if you want to pay attention to Marvel and DC, good places to start. Every couple of years, they do a reboot where they do a whole huge new line of number ones. Sometimes they don't reboot the entire line of comics, but they'll send out like a huge wave of new number ones, and usually those are a good place to start. They can be a little controversial because often in reboots, they change things, sometimes not for the better, sometimes they change things for the better about a certain character, but those are usually good places to start. I wouldn't worry yourself about these crazy big continuity shifting stories that especially DC has, but Marvel has them too. Marvel has crazy alternate universe stories. I wouldn't worry about those at first if that's what intimidates you. I would just start with a particular character you want to read. Google them up. What's the best run for this character or essential readings for this character, and order them online. Start reading and just use Wikipedia, expand your knowledge, and the more your knowledge will get expanded, the more ready you'll become to trying to grasp the crazier high concept universe bending monsters eating other universes, retconning continuity stories, because I know those can be really intimidating and confusing for anyone, especially those who have very little knowledge of like actual like comic books. And I wouldn't concern yourself with those at first. And even though those I think are some of the beauty of superhero comics that they are able to facilitate these crazy stories, I wouldn't worry about them at first. You know, just jump in and start reading. Find a new number one, find a relaunch, find a beginning of a creative run, and just start reading a superhero comic. You know, that's what you want to read. Like I said, there's plenty of Image comics that you can look up. Look up like the top 25 Image comics to read, and you'll find those. There's just plenty of comic books you should read, and if you just want to jump in, jump in. Each company has a different flavor, and you just kind of feel your way around what you might like, you know? So hopefully this will help. I know basically my advice was just to start reading, but I think that it really is true. You can do yourself a favor and find a good starting point, and there are plenty of these for these characters, and there's really nothing else I can give advice for than to start reading. There's a comic book YouTube channel. It's called one of them is Variant Comics. They have really good videos about explaining about the origins and history of certain characters. And they also give a reading list at the end. I'd recommend those maybe as a starting point for certain characters if you want to learn more. And there's other comic book channels like Comic Story that tell you about certain storylines. And those might be good places to start too. But yeah, hopefully that didn't annoy you by my advice just being to start reading. And I think we're going to start a series about some of my most recommended series to start reading. Uh, DC, Marvel, Image, or otherwise. And I might try to do these videos like once a month and just kind of spotlight a comic book that I think is worth your time. And I'm going to tell you why and what it's about and why it's so good. and just kind of share my love for these comics, and maybe some of you guys will be inspired to pick them up too. So thanks for listening. I'll talk to you guys later, and see ya. Stay safe.